Hey everyone, welcome to another video of Mule Made Easy. These videos are part of a series that my friend Josh and I are putting together about the changes from Mule 3 to Mule 4. In this one we'll be talking about error handling. Now this is a continuation from a video that we set up about the Mule 4 error itself, so if you haven't, check that out first. Otherwise, let's get right into this. And so we'll start by taking a look at how things map from one to the other. What we have is that in Mule 3, we employ what are called exception strategies to handle errors. And in Mule 4, we have 4 different new concepts to do that. So for example, in Mule 3, we have choice, catch, and rollback exception strategies. And these map directly into what's now known as the OnAir continue. Global exception strategy and reference exception strategy are equivalent to the error handler, and I'll show you guys this later. And then we also have 2 entirely new concepts like OnAir Propagate and Try. Now I'll make a note that I'm not including every possible exception strategy here. There are things like API kit, mapping strategies, and so on and so forth, but I believe these are really the more core exception strategies on Mule 3. But let's get right into OnAir Continue. We can think of OnAir Continue scopes as the direct equivalent of Mule 3 exception strategies. So I think that's the best way to look at them to understand how they work. Basically, whatever processors are within that scope will execute, and then the thread will return to a calling flow if that's the case, or just finish the execution if there's no more, if there's not a parent flow. And I've set up some use cases to show you exactly what I mean. What I've done is I've set up a couple of use cases in Mule 3 and then replicated in Mule 4 to show you how, as far as OnAir continues goes, the code will be almost exactly the same. So let's see these scenarios now. We'll start with the simplest one, which is we'll have this inbound listener, and we'll call this external resource and transform or return to the client the payload from that resource, right? So we'll say result equals to whatever main resource returns. In this case, it's going to give us a successful 200 and some string for its value. So let's see here. So we'll call scenario 1, and here we have 200, and the result is main resource value, which is what that external resource called, a return. Now this wouldn't be an error handling video if I had to show you guys some errors. So let's take a look at scenario number 2 now. And what happened here is that I've set up the call to main resource in this scenario to actually fail. So I'm calling it an exception resource. And so this component will throw an error and will return that response to my client, right? And now this is the problem with Mule, however, is that it will include as part of the reason whatever the error message was. So not only do we get it in the body, but we get it here in the status, in the reason. Which I don't think is neat. I don't think it is really something that the client should be concerned with. They shouldn't really know that, we're failing because we have another 500 that we got from an upstream server. So what we have is that in scenario 3, we're catching that error, right? So we have this catch exception that's catching everything. We're setting the status code to be 500 and setting the payload to be something more informative. And so if we invoke that in scenario 3, this is what we get. We're not divulging any internal implementation errors anymore. Now, I will concede that this is probably a little boring to you if you're very familiar with Mule 3 already, but I promise this will help me make my case when I go over to Mule 4. And in our next scenario, we'll introduce yet another service. A call to another external resource that we wrapped in this enricher. And so what happens is we make that call, we put it in a flow variable named secondary resource, and we use that to compose our response, right? So we have secondary result is whatever came in that flow variable. We've set this one to fail, meaning that this catch exception will be triggered and will return an error response. And so let's see that. This should be scenario number 4. Same thing, right? Internal server error, very sorry. But if this is really a secondary resource, we should be able to do without it, right? And so this is our next scenario. In order to catch the exception only for that processor, however, we have to put it in its very own flow. And so that's why we're using this flow reference here, and we put that HTTP call in its own flow. And so that way we can give it this catch exception strategy where we're catching any error, and as the payload, we're putting kind of a static replacement value, right? So this could be something that says, this is temporary, or, entirely replacing what would have come out of this secondary resource. And then the rest of the code works as it would have, otherwise, if an error had never occurred. And so this is really what the onContinue does. When an error happens, execution continues as if it hadn't, right? And so this is what I'm trying to show you guys. So let's run that. Let's say this is scenario number 5. There we go. See, it took a little bit because we were waiting for that resource to times out. But either way, that error was caught, and we set up our replacement value. So again, the error was caught, but execution continued as if it hadn't. The processors were executed, and the thread was returned to the parent flow. So now let me show you guys this code in Mule 4. And you'll see that it's really almost exactly the same thing. Let me make this bigger. And so we have our listener, our flow reference to a different flow so that we can give this secondary resource its own error handling, the main resource, and then composing the two of them. And so let's take a look at OnAir continue. There's really not much of interest here. It's just empty again, which means that it'll just catch any error. And again, we're setting our payload to be the static value. And data weave, the exact same script, right? So this is what the whole setup was about. From Mule 3 to Mule 4, you go with OnAir continue. Check them out side by side. We see is we can achieve the exact same logic with pretty much the exact same processors and scopes. The only difference, I guess, is that enricher does not exist in Mule 4. We instead have what is the ability to put the result from any processor directly into a variable. I think it's every processor. I haven't checked it, but here we're just telling it to put the response or the result for that from that flow reference directly into the variable called secondary resource, and we can use that, and we'll use that in our data weave. So that's it for catch, but we also have a choice exception strategy, right? And so we'll go into this other configuration file, and the scenario here is that for whatever exception is thrown by the secondary resource, we really only want to replace it, or we want to choose exactly what value to replace it with depending on the exception, right? And so what we set up is this choice that allows us to put different catch exceptions, and this one will specify that this one will be matched to timeout exception, and so we'll put the same value we had before, and for everything else we'll say, okay, we don't have anything to replace it with. And so in our data weave, because of this skip null directive, this will just be skipped when we call this resource. And so we can take a look at this. This should be a resource, scenario number 6. And so there we have it. The catch exception strategy was invoked, it returned a null value, and so it was skipped from our result here. Now, how do we do this in Mule 4 now? Let's go back here. I've set this other one called... Oh, I'm sorry. No, I did not set another one. I was going to do this live, so here we go. What we want to do is add another OnAir continue here, and all we have to do is really drag it on there. Don't need to call a choice or any other type of scope, which is added right on there. And so we'll do OnAir continue and set the payload, right? And in this case, we'll say we want this to be null. And that's exactly how you do multiple catch exception strategies, or the equivalent of multiple catch exception strategies in Mule 4. Okay, this error that it's giving me is because I have to be specific in the multiple ones, because only one of them can be a catch any, right? The first one or the previous ones have to have a specific error that we're catching. And so what we have here is we'll do HTTP timeout. And again, if you haven't checked out my video on error type, please go ahead and do that. I'm assuming that you're familiar with it now. And so, okay, there we go. No more errors now. And so that's equivalent to the choice with multiple catch exception strategies for Mule 3. There you have it. Now, if we go back to our slides, we could start talking about OnAir Propagate. And I think the best way to think about OnAir Propagate is that similar to OnAir Continue, the processor within that scope will execute, but the thread will not return to the parent flow, right? Execution will not continue as if nothing happened. Instead, again, the processor will be executed, but the execution will still be considered as a failure. I think the best way to really understand that is with an example. So consider the following use case. Let's say that for failures with the main resource, every time that this call fails, we want to do something special to that failure, but we still want to use this catch exception strategy, right? We want to catch that exception here, do something specific, and then kind of somehow let the main exception strategy still, execute its processors. There is no easy way to do this in Mule 3 right now. We would have to pull this call to its own flow, give it its own catch exception strategy, do that special logic, and then we don't really have any direct way to give it back to this exception strategy. We would have to pull these two processors and copy and paste them into that exception strategy, or make them their own, make a flow on its own for just these two, and then reference it from that other one. And so if not all of that makes sense, that's okay. The point I'm trying to make is that it's not straightforward. It's not easy to do in Mule. Whereas in Mule 4, OnAir Propagate helps us just a little bit with this. And so I've set up the following implementation to show you this. So I still put the main resource call into its own flow in order to give it this OnAir Propagate. And what's happening here is I'm mocking what would be a call to the external auditing system with this logger. But what OnAir Propagate is doing is it's saying, okay, whenever there's any error with this main resource call, I want you to execute whatever processors are within this scope, but still treat this execution as failed. So what happens is that the logger gets executed, but the error gets propagated as if it was never caught. And so when this throws, or when the error is propagated through this flow reference, this OnAir Continue will be executed, and it will set the payload just as we saw that it did. Taking a look at the logs, we should see that call, right? There we have it. So again, OnAir continues, executes the processors within the scope, and continues execution as if nothing ever happened. OnAir Propagate executes the processor within the scope and propagates the error as if it was never caught. Great, Mule made easy tip number 1. There you have it. Okay, now let's talk about try. Try is the other entirely new concept in Mule 4, and it really is just exception handling specific to processors instead of the entire flow. And so what I just showed you guys in Mule 4, we can simplify even further with try, and this is exactly what it would look like. Now, I won't go into every processor because the logic is the same. I'm just showing you what you could do. And so there it is. We can wrap specific processors in the specific error handling and logic that we want. And so this will work the exact same as the other one. If this processor times out, we set up our static value. Otherwise, we set it to null. I have these backwards actually. So this should go here, and that should go there. So if the main resource happens to fail, we want to propagate that error, and will be caught by the main error handler. So it should make your code neater, I think, as long as you don't abuse it and start putting tries for every single processor. I think it's a welcome addition. And last but not least, we have error handler. And as I showed you at the beginning of the video, is just the equivalent to a global exception strategy from Mule 3. And so I think of a handler as a way of, so I think of flows as having built-in handlers, right? So we have error handling here that allows us to put OnAir continue and OnAir propagate. Handlers is just a way of externalizing that from the flow. And so kind of just like pulling what the flow has and making it standalone. And so, see, we pull it out and we can add all both OnAir scopes. And then you would reference those from within the flows, just as you would in Mule 3. And that pretty much concludes this video on error handling. If I missed anything, please let me know in the comments. I'll be glad to add it to the video or talk about it in the following entry. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching.